The results of the 2020 election revealed surprising disconnections between what polls expected versus what voters decided. In the spirit of bridging communities and building understanding, Impact Hub Houston is excited to host the Houston Innovation Summit's 2020 Core Conversation, On Both Sides, a post-election discussion on the state of Texas, startups, and our union, to examine how different demographic and cultural groups defied assumptions and explore what we can do to bring our country together and move forward. The panel is moderated by Impact Hub Houston CEO and Executive Director Grace Rodriguez and includes speakers Rita Hicks, the CEO and founder of GotSpot, Shayan Deshekar, CEO and founder of Blue Squad and Datafinity, and Edward Espinoza, Executive Director of Progress Texas.
Hey everyone, sorry about that. My name is Rita Hicks, and I am the founder of a Houston-based tech company called GotSpot, and I'm also a local practicing attorney. I come at this with a couple of different lenses. First, I've been an advocate in the military family space for about 10 years, proud wife of a retired Army Special Forces soldier. I also have spent the last 7 years curating civic engagement for the League of Women Voters Houston. So that's everything from candidate fora to help with the voter guide to vote banking on election day. And then the past 2 election cycles, I've also been deeply involved in the dialogue, particularly in the sort of Houston area, among evangelicals and who are sort of sifting their way through political identity right now. So I'm not coming at the question from a particular party perspective or an ideological perspective, but more from an identity perspective.
Thanks, Rita. Shayan, how about you?
Hey everyone, my name is Shayan Deshekar. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Blue Squad. I also have another company called Datafinity, which I founded and I run still. Blue Squad in particular is a app for helping you engage in progressive politics. It helps you get involved with campaigns and local organizations, as well as helping you engage your friends in doing the same thing. My perspective on the whole conversation we're going to have probably stems from my sort of origination as a technologist and entrepreneur, but wanting to get more involved in politics over the last 4 years, and kind of the journey I went on to really learn how the ecosystem operates and how it affects everyone. And that has turned into really trying to learn how to get people kind of hooked into the system and making it more of something that's part of them, not just something that's separate from their identities.
Thanks, Shayan. Go ahead, Ed.
Hey, everybody. My name is Ed Espinoza. I'm the Executive Director at Progress Texas. Progress Texas is a rapid response media organization and message development group that works on telling the progressive side of the story in Texas, though my role here today is less to tell the progressive story and more to talk about the Latino vote in Texas, my community, and what it means for the political landscape, how it has evolved, and how that vote is going to play not only how it played in 2020, but how it will play in future elections. Most of my professional life has been in campaigns, and a lot of it has been working in the Latino community. I'm originally from Southern California. I've done campaigns in 15 or 16 states. Hard to keep track after a while. Landed in Austin about 10 years ago. My last stop before getting to Austin was at the Democratic National Committee. The Western States I was the Western States Director at the DNC during Obama's first term. Texas is one of those states where they could go in the West, could go in the South, it could go in the Midwest. It becomes personnel dependent. Who can DC send to Texas that Texas won't send back? So I found my way here, met a girl, ended up moving to Texas. So yeah, I'm sure you all heard the story before. Happy to be here with y'all.
Yeah, that's a common story. People come here for work and then end up staying here for family.
Yeah.
Well, let's just launch into it. So what have the election 2020 results revealed about American voters and civic engagement for you and the communities that you are involved with? We can do this as a round robin as well and go in the same order. So Rita, would you like to start?
Sure. We had a prep call where we were talking about this. And for me, I think the biggest theme is that there are no monoliths. we could do a series of 1-hour conversations about blank is not a monolith. And in the communities of which I'm a part, that's certainly something that I saw. There was a broad spectrum of opinion among military families about who to vote for this election cycle. There's a broad spectrum among evangelicals. And here in Houston, just in general, and it feels like people fell into the two camps. Either they had a very strong opinion that was framework based. In other words, I'm concerned about the framework of democracy and that's driving my vote. Or they had a framework that was very issue based, whether it was a single issue, like among the evangelical community, there's a single issue that often rises to the top, or whether it was a collection of issues that were brought to the forefront, particularly because of the year that we're navigating. But it felt like people fell into one of those two camps. Either they were worried about the framework or there were very specific things that were driving their decisions at the polls.
I think for me, the thing I focus on most coming out of the election is learning sort of the limitations and where we have to go with next as far as how to engage different communities. I think historically, the way to engage the electorate has been a very top-down approach, especially during presidential cycles. We saw a lot of tactics change, particularly in Texas campaigns between 2018 and 2020, in my opinion, to their detriment. And I think the takeaway for me is whatever sort of political leanings you have to treat each community as its own, and really understand what matters to them rather than trying to apply kind of national narratives too. And that's really what politics should be about at the end of the day, is engaging the community and helping the community rather than just trying to secure a vote. So I hope that's one thing that both regular folks as well as political campaigns take away from this cycle.
I would say that for all of the issues that each side tried to bring up, you saw conservatives talk about law and order and the economy, and you saw progressives talk about protecting coverage for pre-existing conditions and talk about COVID. Neither of those issues broke through, and the reason being is that 2020, much like 2016, was very unusual in that both elections were just dominated by one issue, and that issue was Trump. And it's very unlike. I mean, I've been through 13 or 14 election cycles now. I've never seen anything like it. And even the 2018 midterm, as much as he was an issue in that midterm, other issues were able to break through. So I think it made it very difficult for down ballot candidates to get their message out with as much money and time and effort that was put into it. And the evidence, I think, that really underscores this theory is that you saw a net gain of 0 seats in the legislature in Texas on both sides, a net gain of 0 seats in the congressional delegation, 1 state Senate seat that shifted, which probably should have been in the other camp to begin with. But you also saw this at the national level. You saw a total of 6 seats move at the congressional level. This is a very unusual stalemate. And I think it really is kind of, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, in that there was one issue that everybody was focused on. It's the issue that we've largely talked about ever since then. But there are obviously other elements to it. We saw the Latino community behave differently than people expected it to. And a lot of that, again, comes back to this overarching issue that dominated this election.
That is a really interesting point, and that the biggest issue was actually Trump. Yeah. And I would love to hear your perspectives on what do you think Trump represents for the different communities that you also communicate with. Ed, do you want to start with that since you brought that to light?
Sure. After the 2016 election, we talked a lot about identity politics, and that didn't come up as much in 2020, but it probably should have. because identity politics, it never went away. It's alive and well. And, there was this debate after 2016 that Republicans don't engage in identity politics and that Democrats do. And I actually disagree with that. I think that Republicans do engage in identity politics. It just happens to be largely the same identity. And in this case with Donald Trump, and this is an important thing to recognize, is that his voters really embrace him because they identify with what he has to say. They identify with the way he does things. Whereas Biden is in my opinion, is honorable and capable, but nobody's buying a Biden Halloween mask in October, right? Like, they don't have the same connection to him, even if they support him. So I think that identity played a role in that. I'm sorry, Grace, your question was about identity?
It was actually about, what does Trump represent? You're talking about, also, can you define identity politics for people who aren't familiar with that? But what does Trump represent for a lot of these voting blocks? So the people who did vote for him from different communities, what does he represent for them? Because I assume it's going to be a little different from Latinos who voted for Trump versus military people who voted for Trump, right?
Right, and that's why I'm sorry. That's why I got to the identity question. There is, I think that it identifies a perspective on life. Like, how do you view life? Do you view government as something that is workable, that we can use to work for all of us, or do you view it as something that is largely in the way and just needs to be shaken up and turned upside down? And I think that view of the role of government really affects how people view their candidates and how they veer towards it. If you don't feel that government is doing anything for you or looking out for you, then even though Trump is the government, he's probably your candidate in this race.
Diane, what about you?
I think going back to something I said, the issue being Trump in this election, I think that's true. But I think it becomes segmented in terms of how Trump affects each person, right? I think that ends up shaking out differently based on the type of person you are, the community you're from, like, sort of thing. So I think, like, the net result, like Ed said, is like this kind of stalemate that results from the overall election. But I think that's almost like a coincidence. I think it's different communities reacting to Trump in a different way, and that result ended up being what we saw. Some communities are going to identify with the, fake alpha male personality that Trump puts out there, and that's going to be a thing. But other communities, like in the Asian community, they're going to identify with his certain immigration policies. That might be, some people might think that's hypocritical, but in their minds it's not. And some of them might identify with his economic policies for whatever reason. And the alpha male component is just like sort of a bystander. It's just, it's there, we deal with it, whatever. But that's not the issue driving me. So I think it's to understand what's happening, you have to kind of look at the individual pieces, and then it'll sum up to a certain result. But that net result isn't actually telling the story, I think.
Sean, can you talk a little bit more about the Asian identity? Because you and I are both Asian, but we're very different Asians. So how did you see that different Asian communities might have identified with Trump or not?
Yeah, but I can speak to personal experience. So I would say, I have a community of Asian Americans who are around my age or younger. I'm approaching 40 for those that are on the call. So late 20s to late 30s Asian Americans who are mostly progressive. And they, there's definitely a collection of thought or identity there around progressive policy and what that means for Asian Americans, and viewing America as this place of opportunity and kind of the aspirational aspects. But then I also have my parents and other folks in their community who have a very different perspective, who had to worked through a lot of hardship to get to where they are, and definitely see progressive policy as handouts and things like that, and don't want to have they don't want to have, to put it simply or maybe simplify it, they don't want to make things easier for folks just because. And they have small businesses or large businesses that they've worked really hard to build up, and they really believe in a very capitalist mindset and want to make sure everything's working in their favor towards that. So that's a different community as well. That's really just the Indian community, and I know there's other factors in the Asian communities. I can try to speak to things that have happened in Houston, like with the Vietnamese community and stuff like that. But that's really more like me reading on that, not personally experiencing it.
Yeah, it goes kind of to what Rita was saying earlier, that no one community is a monolith, right? So when people talk about the Hispanic vote or the Asian vote, obviously there's a lot more nuance to it. And I did want to bring up, it seems like there's a generational difference too, right? Whether you were born and raised in the US versus where you were an immigrant to the US in terms of first generation, second generation, not just age. But so Rita, going to that, within the Asian community, which Cheyenne alluded to, the Vietnamese community in Houston has historically been very Republican. John McCain was one of their heroes because during the Vietnam War, obviously, the military was a positive thing for the Vietnamese American or Vietnamese community that immigrated to Houston. So with the role that the military plays and how that helps shape our identities, can you also answer that question of what does Trump represent to people within not just the military community, but you also mentioned the evangelical community and some of the other communities that you also work with?
Sure. It's interesting within the military community, there is a generational component of it because historically the Republican Party has been the more hawkish party, has been the party that has provided pretty steady support for all of our work abroad. And so I would say, particularly among the sort of more senior ranks of veterans, you tend to see more people voting Republican. And then even coming down into some post 9/11 vets, especially the ones who served without a family, the sort of tough guy attitude that Trump projects can be attractive to them. But among the people who are serving now, particularly people who serve with their families, and among people who are very, steeped in foreign policy, the attitude is very different because when you're serving, what you need is stability of leadership, right? You need stability around the policies that are going to affect your family, around the policies that are going to affect our ties abroad. They're going to have an impact on missions that are being run. So I really saw a divide among military. It was partly generational and partly where you are in your service. But there was clearly a little bit of a tension of identity there. And what's interesting is that it parallels on totally different issues what I saw in the evangelical community. Because again, historically, since the mid 80s when the moral majority, sort of started aligning more and more evangelical churches with the Republican Party, that was kind of an easy marriage in some respects because it was based on primarily the issue of abortion. And that certainly is still a strong tie in that community. There were a lot of people in 2016 and 2020 who are, voting for Trump on the premise of the Supreme Court and what he's done there and trying to outlaw abortion. But this year has brought into sharp relief a tension that's always been there around, should we expect our leaders to reflect our values? And very clearly, the president does not reflect Christian values. A lot of people were willing to overlook that in 2016, but now it's not only that, it's also, does sanctity of life, just mean worrying about abortion, or does it mean worrying about police brutality? Does it mean worrying about inequalities, in our communities? Does it mean worrying about all these other things? So again, I think it's largely generational. You see a lot of younger people really thinking about this marriage that's been going on for a really long time. I'm really not sure that really reflects me and my faith journey anymore. So you definitely saw that tension in the conversation. Where it was a lot sort of easier to identify why people were voting was sort of in the blue collar space that I navigate. So I'm from West Texas. I grew up among roughnecks, and I spent about 5 years doing a whole lot of work in Appalachia and coal mining workouts. So big coal companies going under, job losses, all these things. And what you see in that sort of non-college educated white space is people who are dealing with a lot of desperation, a lot of anger, because they're seeing jobs go away, and they're seeing their towns shrink, and they're seeing the opportunities for their kids being less than the opportunities that they walked into in adulthood. And they're just worried. And it's a lot of worry and anger and frustration that this president, just by virtue of his demeanor and message, has kind of tapped into. And they cling to him because they feel heard, and for a long time they haven't felt heard, and they need a place to put their anger. And he's offering, blame it on immigrants, blame it on this, and blame it on that. And when you're only worried about how to make your next paycheck and how to feed your kids and how to make sure your kids are clothed, it doesn't leave a lot of time to scrutinize the sound bites and think, okay, but what might I be missing in that message? So in that space, you saw a whole lot more consistency of loyalty to Trump from 2016 to 2020 than in either of the other spaces I navigate.
Rita, I have a question. What would be like the tipping point for someone, let's say in the evangelical community, where they focused on the issue the issues that Trump and like Supreme Court picks were trying to push through, versus how they identified as, let's say, a Christian? Like, did you see moments where people were like, I've had enough? And like, if so, what were there trends in that? I'm just honestly curious about that.
Cheyenne, that's an interesting question. And part of it, I don't mean this in a super negative way, but I can't think of better language, but part of it comes down to motive, right? It's easy to say, I'm voting this way because I care about saving babies, and not think really hard about whether that soundbite actually translates into saving babies or whether it's the best way. Where I have seen movement is where somebody has kicked open the door a little bit to an actual dialogue with an actual group of people. It goes back to what you were saying at the beginning around it needs to be hyper-local. Because when you start talking about the fact that access to healthcare provided by the Affordable Care Act actually moved the needle on abortion, and access to sex education in schools actually reduced abortion, not bans necessarily, because abortion was banned in 44 states in 1973, and the rate was higher then per capita than it is now. But you have to get to the place where you have a conversation about, like, do you care about the outcome or do you care about the soundbite? And that requires a lot of patience and diligence and person-to-person conversation that really social media is not a great medium for. And that's the best medium that we've had this year because we're all stuck in our homes mostly.
That brings up a good point. One of the questions that was brought up in the chat by Verena is, how have social networks and the age of misinformation influenced the results? And I'd love to hear that from all of you, because I feel like that's one of the reasons why different populations defied stereotypes, right? There's, Ed, I know that in an earlier conversation, your panel talked about a persuadable target voter versus a base voter. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
So that's one common misconception about the Latino community, is that it is not a base vote community. It is a persuasion community. And one of the things I have said a lot in the last 2 weeks is that everyone in the Latino community seems like everyone has a Republican brother. I have at least 2 of them. I think that one of them is hiding something from me. But like the point is that there is a diversity of politics in our families. And I think that when we're talking about the role of social media and all this, is that our media consumption habits are not the same from person to person. And, my organization got a hit in USA, a couple of hits in USA Today, a couple of hits in New York Times this year. That's great. The voters we're trying to reach, they're not reading the New York Times. They're not reading USA Today. We don't live in the same media environment that we grew up in. There's, my parents, my dad is from Peru, immigrated here, where media was completely different there. My mom is from the United States. Mom grew up watching Walter Cronkite because everybody watched Walter Cronkite. I grew up, we had 3 anchors on TV. And now take your pick, right? Like if you want conservative news, you can get conservative news. If you want sporting news, you can get sporting news. You can get gardening news from multiple places. I think that social media is good and it's bad. And it's bad in that we can burrow into some silos that don't give us the full picture. It's good in that we have ways to reach people that we've never have before. And you can do it a lot more efficiently and a lot more affordably if you do it right. Here's one of the problems. I mean, there's so many problems with it. I won't get into all of those, but let me get to the campaign side of problems is that a lot of what's happening in campaigns is formulaic. TV, mail, field, all are important in their own way. Field is still very important, but TV is just not what it used to be. But you still have this dedication to it that honestly just doesn't, if you care about data and science, I don't know why you care about TV the way you used to, because it just doesn't translate the same way. So I think that I realize this is a long answer because I think it's a very in-depth question. Social media is a necessary evil, that it's also not necessarily evil. I think that it just has to, it is a sophisticated area that we have to spend more time in. And frankly, we just don't do it. I'll tell you, the one person who does get it very well is Donald Trump. He knows how to use it.
Well, he was a reality TV show star, right? So he understands how to use the media to effectively communicate what he wants.
Right. Whether it's true or not.
Cheyenne, as somebody who does care deeply about data and science, how do you respond to that? How do you talk about, I mean, you mentioned earlier tactics have changed. Can you describe what you think is going to be effective in connecting us or to help people communicate their messages better and reach different voters better?
Yeah, so I think going back to the original question that the person asked in chat, I think an important thing to understand about social networks is that they are really good at amplifying your own belief structure, your existing belief structure. So, humans are not designed to understand things at scale very well, or relative scale. So if I go into a room and I meet, there's like 10,000 people in this room, and I meet 100 people who have the same opinion as me, I'm just going to assume that everyone else in the room has that same opinion. And then that opinion is now fact. What social media does is it basically lets you do that on every micro opinion you have all the time. And then it has this very, very efficient loop in reinforcing that thought process. The entire algorithm is designed to do that. In fact, if people here haven't seen it, you should definitely watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix. It perfectly articulates how that process works. But going to Ed's point, that's a problem, but it also gives us the solution, right? Because if we want to connect with people, connect with voters, constituents, whoever, these companies have given us the perfect mechanism to do that. You just need basically an entry vector to do it. So if you create good content and you get an engagement loop running, you can quickly amplify whatever position you're having. And as it turns out, I'm actually reading this book on something called moral psychology. That's a big reason why people end up believing something, is because they see social pressure to believe it. So, I'd like to believe that we're all purely rational beings, but that's actually just not the case. So you need social pressure to get people, on your side position, however you want to look at it. So yeah, it's frustrating that that's how things are from a sort of logical, perfect utilitarian perspective, but it gives us a perfect blueprint for how to affect change.
I have 2 concerns that go hand in hand. One of them is indirect, and that's that we do a very bad job of distinguishing between what's journalism and what's everything else. And the reason why that's important is because journalism is subject to laws that keep it honest, libel laws, defamation laws. When you're reading actual news, you can be assured that it might be a little slanted, but the facts are right. Whereas so much of what we actually consume is not news. I mean, I'm thinking about this lawsuit in New York earlier this year where Tucker Carlson was sued for libel, and the court ultimately dismissed the suit because she found that Tucker Carlson lied, but he's not news, therefore it's not illegal. But then that leads into my second point, which is the two things that most people share because they're quick and easy and catch your attention are snippets of videos and memes. And when you have access to snippets of videos of Tucker Carlson, who did lie but is not news, you're still spreading disinformation. Yeah. Or if you have a meme, and the problem with memes, of course, is that most people are super lazy. They see something, it catches their eye, it engages their lizard brain, they go, ah, and they send it to all the people who disagree or all the people who will say yes without actually thinking hard about whether it's true or not. And the problem with the way all of the social networks are structured right now is you can report it and they'll delete the original post. But if it was already shared 150,000 times, forget it. The genie's out of the bottle and there's nothing that can be done about that. So from a policy perspective, it's been on the horizon for a long time that the laws are going to change to close the loophole to make social networks like Facebook and Twitter behave more like news outlets. And I actually am looking forward to when part of that involves figuring out a way to put the genie back in the bottle, like not just eliminating an original post, but all of its progeny when something has been identified as false. Because it's really hard to have a truthful conversation with somebody that's nuanced and right when this meme that they can digest in 5 seconds affirmed their belief that they're right.
Yeah, I want to add a few things to this, and I'll try to be brief. I think that we don't use social media as well as we could, but when you think about how people communicate and how they get their news, it's not always from news. Like one of the things we teach in our media trainings is that there is the press and there is the media. And the press are the journalists and the media are every one of us who are in this room right now. If we have a Twitter account or any other kind of a social media handle, we're suddenly the media. And that's an important distinction because media literacy in this country is not very high, and it's getting lower because there's just this, for lack of a better word, there's a sewer of information out there. It's not all good. Incidentally, there's an article on how one side is dominating the social media debate and the other side is not. I'll park it into the chat if you all are interested. It ran yesterday in the Daily Beast. Some of you may or may not agree with it. I think it's a compelling read either way. But think about, this is the last thing I'll say. Think about not just social media, but the way we communicate. We're probably all in a group text of some kind. And that's going off every day so often that you have to mute it. But that's where people get a lot of their information from. And what goes through those chats isn't always going to be Anderson Cooper.
Actually, I'm going to add one thing to that because I think it's really important. I think we have a tendency to just, like Rita was saying, just retweet or whatever, repost the thing we agree with and mean whatever. But then in the group chat, like Ed's saying, like with our family and whoever posts something we really disagree with, we'll just ignore it because we don't want to get into it. This is like a hard ask, but I would ask everyone to actually fight the temptation to ignore that, but do so in a respectful way with your family. There is a way to engage people you care about on issues you disagree with. I think it's very important to think of yourself as part of the system rather than a bystander in it. You are in the best position to affect the opinion of someone that you know. You're much more powerful than a social media stream, right? That WhatsApp group chat is going to be way more powerful so long as you treat the other person with respect and not with anger. So I know that's a hard thing to do, but I would just recommend everyone to practice that, try things out that can work. I got my dad, a lifelong Republican, to vote for Joe Biden, even though he's in the fracking industry. So it can be done.
Yeah, which brings us, I'm really excited about this conversation right now because it brings us to this question that is also being shared within the chat from Jerry. Is it good to make social media behave like the media? Isn't the point to get away from curated content and allow people to express themselves even when we disagree? So how do you help navigate press versus media versus social media? And then also, how do you reach influencers who are actually disseminating a lot of this misinformation or disinformation even? How do you combat that? How do you help people understand what are facts versus, fake news and all of these other types of claims? So going back to how do you help people navigate that? And then how do you reach influencers, or how do you at least combat influencers who are spreading misinformation? Ed, would you like to start with this?
I think that Twitter has done a good job recently by adding disclaimers to claims that are made by certain individuals, president being one of them. So I think that's one. What I try to do, so I'll get calls from people and they'll say, look, there's just so much out there. I don't know where to begin. Like, news is starting to feel like the stock market, overwhelmed by the stock market, don't know where to start, so I just don't. And this is what I tell them. I said, look, pick a couple of news outlets that you can reliably turn to. And if one of them is opinion media that is conservative or liberal, that's fine. Just balance out your media diet with something that is not. And this is a harsh truth for the news media, but paywalls are killing news. When you create a barrier to real news, you allow fake news to fester. So what I do is I realize it's a hard reality because news organizations have to survive somehow. But what I suggest is that people turn to a free news site such as NPR or your local TV station, or even a national news station like NBC or one of the other big ones, and have a place where you can go to on a regular basis. If you live in a place like Houston, get a subscription to the Houston Chronicle, or at least read the Houston Press, or something that is local, give you a view on what's happening, and then build out from there. And I think that can help. But people have to look at social media with a dose of skepticism, the same way they would look at somebody trying to just sell them something randomly on the street. I think that we have the potential as a community to get there. We have to have the will to get there. And when you've got hard hat lunchbox guys who've got a real busy life and a lot going on in their life, they may not have the will to sort out what's real news and what's not news. And I don't say that condescendingly or negatively. I say that as matter of factly, that people have a lot going on in their lives. If they don't have the will to sort that out, or an outlet that they trust, then that's gonna be a problem. But if we can find a way to help that will and help identify those outlets, then I think as a community we can make some strides.
Rita, I know you work with a lot of communities that are also in rural areas. How do you still help them, also get access to factual information or not?
I was thinking about that actually, and it's really hard because when you're talking about people, and I'm talking specifically about, this working class, blue collar white person, but it applies, I think, more broadly to people who are working very long hours for, very little pay, and they have families and all these other obligations, and are probably not paying for media because it's just not in the budget. It's really hard to stay informed. Usually the way they stay informed is that there's a TV in the break room so that when they go get their morning coffee or they go eat their lunch, or maybe the TV is on at home during dinner, those are the sort of three sweet spots during the day when they're consuming video media, which I actually think that the much more reliable sources are written media. And I agree with Ed that the newspapers they have a vital role in making sure we have accurate information. And there's a hard conversation to be had about how to adjust their business model and make sure that people actually have access to that information. But the people that we are talking about right this minute are just they're not even there. They're only getting, maybe 20 minutes or probably less of news in a day. And it's whoever, turns on the channel is dictating the facts that they hear. So I think a big part of that is pushing hard on all these various media outlets to actually run news programming during those specific hours. Because when it's opinion stuff over lunch, what you're hearing is, Rush or whomever, and that's not news. But the other piece of it really does come down to like dialogue between people in that community and intentionality around making sure that, we're having conversations with that working class group of people to understand what they need, to understand that they're seen, and to make sure they understand that somebody actually is working on these various issues. Unemployment in Appalachia is often a death sentence because it also means a lack of access to insurance. A lot of people don't know the whole reason that they're able to pay for the treatments that they're getting right now, even without a job, is because of the Affordable Care Act, because nobody's had that conversation with them. And so, I think a lot of it comes down to like making sure that there's access available to that local media and news in those specific windows of the day where we have that person's attention, but also it's just a whole lot of groundwork in these communities. And it can't happen in the 14 weeks ahead of an election. It has to be sort of it has to be a consistent message in that community. I mean, honestly, that's the magic that Stacey Abrams worked as an example in Georgia. Is she started working on that community in 2016 and even before that, and has been a constant, presence in those communities, just having conversations over coffee and being involved in local organizations. And if we want to make sure people are informed and make good choices and vote for their interest, those are the kinds of conversations that have to be happening on the ground.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
just said, go ahead.
I was just reiterating that. I think so. Speaking more to like the political side of things, I was in a sort of after action Zoom call with a Tarrant County Dems party a few weeks ago, and they were trying to figure out how they can reach groups or voters who are like living in apartment buildings, or like, we don't know those people. And so my response is, you have to get to know those people. Like, there's just no way around it. You can't treat voters as lists. You have to treat them as actual people. And like Rita was saying, meet them where they live, where they are, engage that. That is going to be a lot more powerful than any sort of like social media news consumption or anything like that.
Rita, what you also shared just made me realize how important local businesses are in terms of shaping people's opinions by what they are playing on the screens that are in their places. I know when I take my car to the dealership to get checked out, whatever's on the screen, it just stays on. Nobody changes the channel, and it tends to be MSNBC. And then if I go to a hair salon, or if I go, to another local business, it's really important, I guess, what businesses decide to show on their screens. And one of the things that I also want to touch on in addition to that is what Ed had mentioned earlier about the bias in different media. And actually, all of you have talked about All Sides has a media bias chart for which media is more left-leaning versus right-leaning. And then looking at the ones that are in the center, I feel like those are the media channels, I guess, that maybe businesses should consider sharing within their work environments to make sure, one, that they don't give the appearance of bias, but another, just to make sure that people are getting more factual information versus anything that is more opinion-based, and so that we all have a common understanding. Ed, you were talking about Walter Cronkite earlier. I feel like we don't have this one, like the top 3 news media anymore, so we can't agree on what are facts versus opinion. So I wanted to get a better understanding of when it comes to very specific groups. Let's say, Ed, in Florida, I remember seeing an image where they said a little over 70% of the Cuban population voted for Trump versus a little over 70% of the Puerto Rican population voted for Biden. When it goes into these more ethnic or more niche or nuanced cultural groups, how do you reach them? How do you make sure that we start getting onto this same kind of factual information space?
Let's start with the barrier that I mentioned earlier about people who are busy and the hard hat workers, thinking about the kind of workers that take a shower when they get home from work as opposed to before they go to work, right? Here's one of the problems with our news. News is hard. It's serious. It takes a real interest to want to find out what's going on. And when you're dealing with a world that is as complex and busy as it is now, we don't have venues that make it very easy for people to want to get news. If we could find a way to make news easy, fun, dare I say, or just desirable by any means, I think people are going to be more willing to engage. I'll give you a perfect example. TMZ brands itself as entertainment news, and I guarantee that more people are watching that news most nights than they are watching the news about what's happening in their area. The news formula isn't as compatible to our society as it used to be. And one of the things I think could be helpful is if we had news that wasn't so serious, that wasn't yelling at each other, that wasn't to the point to where you just, God, I mean, if you turn on cable news and you see a debate and it's two people just going at each other, like, why would anybody invite that into their lives? Especially if you have a limited amount of time in your day to take a break from work. I think that finding a venue that makes it a little bit easier, a format that makes it a little bit easier and can be factual, can work. I mentioned TMZ. Look, ESPN also has the type of programming where they have people with opposing viewpoints that come together, and they either make it fun or they make it interesting, but they find a way to capture the audience and to keep the audience coming back. We have not found that in politics. The nature of politics makes it hard, but it doesn't make it impossible. Jon Stewart, Trevor Noah have done it for years. Samantha Bee is doing it. John Oliver is doing it. It's not happening on the right as much. I think there's the potential to bring both sides together and to make it work. I think that's bigger than me or maybe any of us here right now, but a pie in the sky solution to the problem could be to change the way we deliver news for consumption.
Thanks. That's a great transition to what can we do? What can Rita, Cheyenne, you represent startups. What do you think the startup community or the small business or entrepreneurship community can do to help move us forward?
I think it's a couple of things. One, in terms of sort of internally, set the culture that leaves space for people to educate themselves on the issue. And I saw a lot of small businesses do that this year where, election day was a holiday. And if you were going to vote early, then you could choose a different day to be your holiday. And, there are a number of sort of the larger companies that will have voter registration drives on site, from nonpartisan people. I think, setting that culture that, we want to be good citizens, we want to be informed, and we're not going to tell you who to vote for or how, but we really want you to educate yourselves on the issues, and we care about that, is a good culture to set. I think, also setting a culture of knowledge where you are thinking about, okay, usually what happens when televisions are on in a place is that whoever got there first turns out what they want, and that's where it stays. But I do think making sure that there's more sort of balance in the perspectives that are presented. If it's going to be news, let's make sure that it's a balance and that it's actual news programming. I mean, setting those things internally is good so that your team understands the importance of being informed, making sure that what we're speaking is truthful, and then, exercising our rights as corporate citizens. The other piece of it, though, externally is understanding what's going around that's going to impact your business and the community. And there are lots of ways to do that. For me, probably one of the most impactful is even as a startup, to find a local chamber, and particularly the small ones that are pretty high touch are great places to do this. You can become a member at a relatively low price point, and they are already out there looking at the policies that are going to impact your business and the ripple effects in those communities, and they can help you stay informed, and they can tell you when there's an action item, and you can choose to participate in it and not. But then you have somebody whose job it is to be involved from a policy perspective, helping you stay more informed. And if you have the luxury of being involved in more than one, then even better. And in Houston in particular, but around the state, there are so many great, smaller identity chambers, either geographically focused or focused on, who you are as a business owner. I think it's setting that culture internally and then finding that partner externally that can help you stay engaged and know what you can do to help your business, but also help your community.
I think Rita's answers on how businesses can do it is great. So I think that's the answer right there, what you just gave. I would extend that a little further to people, because what Rita's basically saying there, if I can summarize, is the business should think of itself as part of the community, not as a separate entity. And that extends to people as well. I'm going to sound a little cheesy here, but like our government, I think we think of ourselves as our government as only for the people, and we forget about the by the people and of the people part, right? And so the same thing for people. Like, stop thinking of the government as a separate entity. Think of it as something that you can participate in at a local level. I mean, I started Blue Squad because after the 2016 election, I did a Google search for local political meetups. I found Battleground, Texas, and I went that weekend, right? Everyone else can do that. Find a group in your neighborhood that you can go to and just show up. And I guarantee you, like, the path will open up for you and you'll get hooked. So the businesses can do that from their perspective, and I think people should do that from their individual lives.
One last thing I'll add, and I'm the CEO of my company, and for me, the other thing that's really important is keeping an eye on the policies that are going to have a positive or negative impact on my people. So, actually, Florida is a great example. I mean, they voted one way for the president, but they also voted for a $15 an hour minimum wage, which is really incredible for sort of people at the sort of base of their working class pyramid. And so I know so many business owners who, would categorize themselves as conservative in Florida, who made sure that their employees and the people within their sphere were aware of that ballot measure and aware that they supported raising the minimum wage to a livable wage in Florida. And so as a leader in a company too, I think it's really important to keep your eye on the things that are going to make life better for your people and make it clear that you support those things, because you're taking care of your community and the community inside of your company that you want to grow too.
Ed, do you have anything to add?
I think that getting engaged with a group, like humans are social animals just by nature, right? And getting involved in any kind of a group, something you care about, or something that is active, that is empowering locally, is the start of any type of engagement. And one of the things that I like to tell people is that our politics cannot begin and end with elections. The democracy is like a muscle, and to keep it healthy, you have to exercise it. And when the election is over, you've got the legislative session, you've got Congress, you've got your city councils. And in between those things and elections, you've also just got your activism. If you care about trails, there's a trail foundation for you. If you care about healthcare, there's an issue that advocates for healthcare. There's something out there. And that first step, like Rita said a minute ago, is getting involved. And I think that everybody has the power to do that. And it seems like a little thing, and it seems like a thing that may not be a big deal at first, but 3 years later, suddenly you realize you're an expert on this issue, and you know all these things that you didn't realize you knew about because you've been getting the newsletter, because you went to a meeting or an event, or you give $10 a month, and that builds up that political muscle, and I think it makes everybody stronger.
It's definitely something that we do with Impact Hub Houston, and that we also teach our entrepreneurs to do. It's a part of design thinking, right? So any entrepreneur would probably know this already, but you put the user first, or you're people centric, right? What do they need? And how can you help them get what they need? And how do you help support them also on the path to getting what they need? So in terms of that, for the entrepreneurs and the advocates and organizers who might be listening, what data do we need to gather to better understand our, the voters, our markets, and so on, so we can become better at that? Rita, go ahead, Cheyenne.
You're asking like what information do we have to gather?
Yeah, like what are we missing, I guess. So if we, for instance, we were all talking about the nuance from Hispanic voters to actually Mexican voters, Colombian voters, Puerto Rican voters. What other kind of data, not just demographic data, but is there something that we need to be paying attention to in order to better understand voters or people in our markets?
Um,
Or maybe
I
Ed,
think
go ahead.
I was saying, like in terms of like political action, I mean, to be honest, like that's one of the things that we're trying to solve at Blue Squad. So like we're trying to make it so that you can help the groups that you're trying to support better understand the people you know, since you know them the best. So we're big advocates of what's called relational organizing, where the primary sort of vector for organizing is just like getting people together, kind of like how we've been talking about. So, you know, I mean, this is almost like a whole other separate panel, honestly, discussion as far as like the deficiencies in like data collection and stuff like that in politics. But I think it comes back to like what you can do like right now today is the same thing. Just keep the people in your life engaged in the issues that you care about, so that when the time comes to help a specific candidate or help a specific group, you already know like who you can activate, those who are ready to go on that thing.
I think part of it is going to always be those sort of very on the ground conversations and looking at each of those as an opportunity to collect data. But I also would love to see, everybody's kicking around polling lately for good reasons, but also for some unfair reasons. But I would love to see some of our data collection shift to more of a qualitative model, because then you can start to see where the monolith separates, right? That's when people are telling you what's on their mind in a more free-form way. It's harder to code, it takes longer, but you get a sense of where you can find actual commonality in the way people are thinking. And I'll give you an example that is not related to this conversation, but we just finished a very large qualitative survey in the military family space where we were just asking general welfare questions. It was, a financial welfare scale and a social welfare scale in partnership with GW. Anyway, what we found was a food insecurity trend. Not because we asked a question about whether anyone could put food on the table, but because when we asked them about the things they worry about financially, people just told us what was on their mind. And so we were able to identify that trend and then sort of ask the follow-up questions to the people who had that commonality to figure out, oh my goodness, this is a sizable group of people. We didn't ask this question, but they're giving us this data anyway. And that's a place where you can follow up and get deeper. So I would love to see a little bit more, treating conversations as data, but also asking some of the qualitative questions in addition to the quantitative questions so that we give people more of a chance to tell us what they're thinking in a format that's not interview, because a lot of people don't feel comfortable answering questions to people face to face, but they'll write. I mean, if social media has taught us anything, it's that people will give us 5,000 words on anything that's on their mind, given the space.
That to me is the biggest thing about the missing piece of data, is that we don't know what we don't know, right? And like when we complain about polling, the problem with polling, many problems with polling, but like one of the big problems with a poll is it won't tell you what you don't ask. And if you don't know what to ask, you're not going to get into those areas to find out what's on people's minds. They're just going to give you the responses to the things that you did ask. So I think that what both Brita and Cheyenne got at is that like maybe we need different technology to find that, but like at a basic element, one of the reasons that door knocking is so effective is because it's a two-way conversation, because you can hear, people have a chance to offer you their thoughts that you otherwise may not have been on your radar. So for instance, my fiance who sits on city council here in Austin, when she was knocking on doors 2 years ago, we had no idea that the soccer stadium was as big of an issue for people because it wasn't being talked about at City Hall in the same way that it was being talked about in the doors. when we got out there, like people were genuinely upset, not that the stadium was coming, but just that they got a tax break. They felt like they should have paid some taxes. Knowing that there was that we wouldn't have been able to poll on that because we wouldn't have known to ask on it. So, to use a Rumsfeld line, what is it? The unknown unknowns or known unknowns or something like that. I think that is the big piece. And I think it's what happened in South Texas with a lot of the Latino vote that ended up going for Trump. And maybe there's a technological solution to it, but we knowing that there's an unknown out there and is the first step. Then figuring out how to find it is the next.
Well, thank you all for sharing your insights. We're at the top of the session right now, but I would love to give you each a platform to be able to say, how can people connect with you and learn more about what you're doing and the organization that you represent? And then do you have a parting message for anyone? And whoever wants to start first, please feel free to go ahead. Or else I'll pick. Ed, go ahead.
My parting message is, I already mentioned it, but I'll mention it again. Democracy is like a muscle. You got to keep exercising it to keep it healthy. It shouldn't end with elections. Get involved either in the legislative session or your local government. See if there's a commission that you can get on, and then join an organization, be active to some extent. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Meowmix, whatever, like all the big, like social, whatever new social media thing is coming up. I'm probably going to try and reserve my name sooner or later. You can also follow Progress Texas on any of those handles. Like I said, Rapid Response Media, fairly prolific in the state, been around for 10 years. And I'd love to connect with you some more on either personal or organizational platforms.
Thank you, Ed. Shan?
Sure. So, like we've all been saying, connecting with the folks you know about is super important, and feeling responsible for your communities is important. I guess at the risk of self-promotion, that is really what we're trying to focus on at Blue Squad. So if you are progressive-minded, using Blue Squad is a great way to do that. It will help you, guide you to get engaged or connected with local groups and candidates and stuff like that. As well as making sure that your friends and family are engaged, registered, and turn out to vote. And yeah, if you want to follow me, I'll actually post my Twitter in the chat. I'm happy to talk with anyone that wants to do that.
Thank you. And Rita?
I'm also easy to find. Name a platform and I'm on it. I'm happy to chat with anyone who would like to. If you're interested in learning more about the League of Women Voters, the chapter in Houston is just lwvhouston.org. But if you happen to be in another part of the state, if you go to lwvtexas.org, you can find your chapter. And I guess my parting thought is really just around discernment. I feel like if we want to navigate our political landscape into a place that makes us all happier, we have to take ownership in it. So we have to have the discipline to make sure that we are consuming accurate information and getting a well-balanced perspective on things. We have to influence the spheres that we're in to make sure that people also have access to that information and that we're talking about it. The politeness I grew up with was we don't talk about religion or politics at the table, but I think that is a broken rule, because the real rule should be we need to learn to disagree the right way, which is we disagree on policy or politics or whatever it is, but that doesn't, get into the personal. I think it's also just taking a breath and not memeing at people. I'm avidly opposed to memeing anything that's important, because that's not a conversation, that's an aha. And thinking hard about why somebody might disagree with you and how you might approach the conversation to really get at, am I missing something, or are they missing something, or do we just come at this from a different thing? I think it's really just all around discernment in the way we educate ourselves and the way we navigate the space, and then the way we engage with other people on any of these topics.
Well, thank you. I just want to echo what Verena said in the chat. She came here looking to hear new perspectives, creative solutions, and actions to move forward, and you all delivered. So great discussion, and thank you all for participating, and thank you all for speaking with us and sharing your insights.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you for having us.